A single line in an unsealed text message can change the meaning of everything that follows. Not because of how it sounds, but because of what it contradicts. According to the court record, newly unsealed messages involving Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds raise serious questions about what was said under oath and whether those statements align with what was privately documented. Why this matters is simple. Courts don't weigh intent, they weigh consistency. When sworn testimony collides with preserved messages, the issue stops being narrative and becomes procedural. This case centers on whether unsealed texts undermine prior statements made to protect professional interests during a period already complicated by strike-era rules, credit disputes, and escalating legal exposure. In the next few minutes, we'll walk through what the texts show, what the testimony claimed, and where the discrepancies appear, step by step without speculation. You'll see how timelines were constructed, how language was framed, and why certain explanations only emerged after documentation became unavoidable. This is not about headlines or reaction. It's about how records function when careers are on the line. As we move forward, pay attention to sequence because in legal disputes, sequence often answers the question before anyone does. To understand why the unsealed messages matter, it's necessary to look first at the sworn testimony itself. In formal statements given under oath, Blake Lively described a version of events that emphasized distance from certain decisions, limited involvement in behind-the-scenes actions, and a lack of direct coordination during critical moments. The language used was careful, structured, and consistent with what one would expect in a high-stakes legal setting. Under oath, precision matters. Testimony is not evaluated on tone or intention, but on alignment with evidence. In this case, the statements place clear boundaries around who knew what, when, and why. Responsibility was framed narrowly. Actions were described as reactive rather than directive, and key moments were positioned as either misunderstood or outside direct control. This framing becomes important once timelines are introduced. The testimony establishes a sequence meant to show compliance with industry rules, with professional roles, and with legal obligations. It also implicitly protects others, particularly Ryan Reynolds, by reinforcing the idea that decisions were compartmentalized and not coordinated in a way that would raise legal concerns. What stands out in the record is not a single claim, but the overall construction. The testimony presents a version of events that is internally consistent when viewed alone. However, sworn statements are not evaluated in isolation. They are tested against documents, messages, and contemporaneous records that exist independently of memory. This is where the stakes become clear. If sworn statements are later shown to conflict with preserved communications, the issue is no longer about interpretation. It becomes about accuracy. Courts are less concerned with why something was said than whether it aligns with what can be verified. At this stage, no conclusion is drawn on intent. But the structure of the testimony matters because it sets the standard against which all subsequent evidence is measured. Once that standard is established, any contradiction, however small, takes on outsized importance. This section lays the groundwork. Before examining the messages themselves, it's essential to understand what was formally claimed, how responsibility was defined, and why those definitions were so carefully drawn. Because once the record expands, those boundaries are tested in ways that testimony alone cannot control. The unsealed text messages introduce a second layer of evidence, one that exists independently of recollection or explanation. Unlike testimony, messages are time-stamped, preserved, and resistant to reinterpretation. They show not how events were later described, but how they unfolded in real time. And it is here that the contrast with sworn statements becomes difficult to ignore. According to the unsealed record, the messages reflect a level of awareness and coordination that appears more direct than what was outlined under oath. Discussions occur closer to key decision points. Language is less cautious. Context is implied rather than formalized. Taken together, the text suggests active engagement during periods that were previously described as hands-off or peripheral. What matters is not tone but proximity. The texts show communication happening alongside moments later framed as distant or reactive. When placed on a timeline, the gap between what was said publicly and what was documented privately narrows significantly. This is where sequence becomes critical. If a message predates a claimed lack of knowledge, it challenges the accuracy of that claim, regardless of intent. The messages also reference decisions with professional consequences, decisions tied to production, coordination, and response. While none of this alone proves wrongdoing, it complicates the narrative presented in sworn testimony. Courts do not ask whether a message was casual or informal. They ask whether it aligns with statements made under oath. This tension is amplified by the context in which the messages surfaced. They were not volunteered. They were unsealed, meaning they entered the record through legal process rather than disclosure. That distinction matters. Evidence introduced this way often carries greater weight because it was not curated to support a narrative. At this point, the issue is no longer about memory or misunderstanding. It is about whether two versions of events can coexist without contradiction. When preserved communication tells a more involved story than sworn testimony, the legal question becomes unavoidable. This section is pivotal because it shifts the focus from explanation to verification. The texts do not argue, they document. And once documentation enters the record, the standard changes. What follows depends on how those messages intersect with what was formally claimed, and whether those intersections can be reconciled under scrutiny. When sworn testimony and preserved messages are placed side by side, the case moves into its most sensitive territory. Courts do not require proof of motive to identify a problem. They look for inconsistency. An inconsistency is measured not by tone or interpretation, but by alignment across time-stamped records. According to the consolidated court record, several unsealed texts intersect directly with moments that were later addressed under oath. These are not vague overlaps. They involve the same timeframes, the same decisions, and in some cases the same language. Where testimony described limited awareness or indirect involvement, the messages suggest proximity and participation. This is where legal scrutiny intensifies. If a witness testifies to a lack of knowledge during a specific period, and messages from that period indicate awareness or coordination, the issue becomes one of accuracy. Courts do not need to establish deception to identify a contradiction. They only need to determine whether statements can reasonably coexist with documented evidence. The implications extend beyond any single message. Testimony is evaluated as a whole. A contradiction in one area can cast doubt on surrounding claims, even those not directly challenged. This is why sequence matters. Once a timeline shows engagement before or during moments described as detached, the narrative begins to fracture. In this case, the intersection also touches on protective framing. The sworn statements appear structured in a way that limits exposure, not just for the speaker, but for others connected to the decisions in question, including Ryan Reynolds. If the texts undermine that structure, the consequences ripple outward. Importantly, none of this requires interpretation of tone or intent. Courts rely on what can be verified. Messages either exist within a claimed window of non-involvement, or they do not. When they do, explanations become secondary to alignment. This section matters because it marks the shift from narrative defense to evidentiary challenge. At this stage, credibility is no longer evaluated subjectively. It is assessed through comparison. And once comparison begins, the margin for error narrows dramatically. What follows from this point is not decided by argument but by documentation. The record does not need to accuse. It only needs to show where two versions of events cannot occupy the same space. Once contradictions appear between sworn testimony and preserved communication, the legal landscape changes. Courts treat these moments with particular seriousness because accuracy under oath is foundational to the process itself. At this stage, the issue is no longer whether actions were justified or misunderstood, but whether statements were factually consistent with what the record shows. According to the unsealed materials, any discrepancy carries potential consequences that extend beyond the immediate dispute. When testimony is challenged by documentation, courts may examine whether inaccuracies were material, meaning they had the potential to influence decisions, outcomes, or protections afforded to others. This threshold matters because material inconsistencies can trigger further inquiry, including supplemental testimony or additional review. The risk is not evenly distributed. Individuals with greater institutional support often have more room to maneuver, while those connected to disputed statements face heightened scrutiny. In this case, the testimony in question appears to function as a form of protective framing, particularly in relation to Ryan Reynolds and broader professional exposure. If that framing unravels, the ripple effects extend outward. What follows is typically procedural rather than dramatic. Courts do not respond to contradiction with spectacle. They respond with questions, requests for clarification, and expanded examination of related evidence. This is how records grow. Each inconsistency invites closer review, and each review introduces the possibility of further disclosure. The professional implications are significant. Legal exposure can affect ongoing projects, future opportunities, and public credibility. Even without a finding of wrongdoing, the process itself imposes costs, time, resources, and reputational strain. For those involved, the presence of unsealed documentation means the dispute no longer remains contained. This is why the order of events matters so much. Once texts are unsealed, they cannot be recontextualized away. They exist as fixed points against which all explanations are measured. Attempts to reconcile them with prior testimony must address sequence, not sentiment. This section underscores why documentation changes everything. It does not accuse or conclude. It narrows the field of explanation. And once that field narrows, outcomes become less about persuasion and more about alignment with the record as it stands. As the record expands, the focus shifts from individual statements to broader implications about credibility and power. Legal disputes of this kind rarely hinge on a single contradiction. Instead, they turn on patterns, how testimony, documentation, and response strategies align over time. Once those elements are visible, the question becomes not just what was said, but how consistently it was said in relation to preserved evidence. In cases involving public figures, credibility carries added weight. Statements made under oath are not only legal assertions, they shape how institutions, partners, and audiences interpret responsibility. When unsealed texts complicate sworn testimony, credibility is no longer abstract. It becomes measurable against timestamps, language, and sequence. This is where influence can no longer smooth over discrepancies. Power plays a central role here. Individuals with strong professional insulation often rely on narrative stability, clear, consistent accounts that limit exposure. When documentation disrupts that stability, responses tend to follow familiar patterns: reframing, narrowing scope, or emphasizing interpretation over sequence. But courts prioritize sequence. They ask what happened first, what followed, and whether later explanations align with earlier records. The implications extend beyond the courtroom. Industry relationships, future projects, and public trust are all affected by how these inconsistencies are addressed. Even without a formal finding, the presence of conflicting accounts can alter professional standing. Studios, collaborators, and insurers pay close attention to how disputes evolve once documentation is unsealed. This is why the existence of preserved communication matters so much. Texts do not adapt to strategy. They remain fixed while narratives adjust around them. As a result, the burden shifts. Explanations must now account for evidence rather than reinterpret it. At this stage, the record speaks louder than intent. The legal process does not require certainty about motive to evaluate accuracy. It requires alignment. When alignment falters, scrutiny increases, and the margin for explanation narrows. This phase clarifies what is ultimately at stake. It is not a single claim or message, but the reliability of accounts offered when consequences were already foreseeable. And once reliability is questioned, the outcome depends less on argument and more on how the record holds up under sustained review. When all the pieces are viewed together, sworn testimony, unsealed texts, and the timelines that connect them, the focus shifts away from personality and toward process. This case isn't about how something sounded or how it was later explained. It's about whether the record aligns with what was said when accuracy mattered most. What makes situations like this consequential is not a single message or statement, but the weight of preserved evidence. Court records don't respond to narrative shifts. They exist as fixed reference points, and once they enter the public record, every explanation must contend with them directly. That is why unsealed documentation changes the stakes so dramatically. The broader question is one of accountability. When influence, reputation, and professional protection intersect, the legal system relies on consistency to separate explanation from contradiction. Whether that standard is ultimately met depends on how the record holds up under continued review, not on speculation, reaction, or public opinion. If you value evidence-based analysis over headlines, this conversation doesn't end here. Stay attentive as more material surfaces, compare claims with documentation, and decide for yourself what the record supports. If you want deeper breakdowns like this, grounded in filings, timelines, and verified information, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and share this work with others who prefer context over noise. Because informed audiences don't just watch stories unfold, they understand how they're built.